Well, happy Friday the 13th, everybody. This is Marguerite Crespillo, and I'm excited today to have uh, Ryan Lundquist with us, who is an appraiser. And I'm really fascinated by some of the stuff he does. He's an incredible blogger, so be sure to go check out his blog at sacramentoappraisalblog.com because he always has some really great insight. And not just for our local market, but he has some really fun and fascinating facts and interesting stuff for, I think that it pretty much applies to anywhere in the U.S. So welcome, Ryan.
Oh, thanks so much for the kind words, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So we kind of had a whole list of questions that we wanted to talk about. I don't know how much of it we'll get through, but here's, I think what most people want to hear right now is what the heck is going on? It seems like the last 60 days that, at least here in Placer County, I don't know about other areas, but here in the Roseville-Rockland area, things have really slowed down. Inventory's increased and buyers are taking longer. So what do you see from the appraisal perspective?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an interesting market. I mean, and I think what's happening now, I think, is related to really what began to happen in early 2012 when the market hit bottom at that time where it really just made sense for values to increase because they had hit a level where renters are going to say, why am I spending this much on rent? I can actually purchase a house for less. And so the market really increased rapidly, and it was a perfect storm where interest rates hit as soon as prices hit bottom in early 2012, interest rates were for the first time below 4%, and then cash investors came in the market a little later, and it really ramped up values very, very quickly. But I think the slowness that we're feeling is directly related to last year. Between May and June, what happened to interest rates? Interest rates increased from 3.5% to 4% over that 1 month period. And there are a lot of real estate articles that said, hey, this is no big deal. This is normal. It's not going to impact the market. But I think that it did. But most importantly, I think one dynamic that happened then is cash investors who had been very aggressive and who their actions, I think, really helped propel values where they wouldn't have gone without those investors. They began to take their foot off the gas pedal. And so what that did, I think it really slowed down markets. You can see really from July on last year, if you're looking at a graph of sales, that sales have been fairly flat. They dipped a little, and there's a slight uptick in spring, which is normal, but it's very, very slight. And yet lots of people are saying, the market's been very flat. There's price reductions. And I think that the market's just trying to figure out what does it mean to be normal now that we're not sort of a market that's on steroids. And so there's sort of this withdrawal stage now and saying, well, what does it mean to be a real estate market that's more driven by the local economy or the job market? So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I saw a lot of that too. It's like all those investors, that was awesome for everybody, but they kind of cut off their nose to spite their face, it almost seemed. They were buying up everything, which was consequently causing values to increase. And
yeah,
I felt that quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, with housing supply was so low that last year where it just created this craziness in the market where buyers had to offer $20,000 above list price, or, they would put things in the contract that say, we will pay $5,000 above appraised value just because there was that incredible competition. And so when you take out so many sales that, like say this quarter, first in 2014, there were about 700 to 800 less cash sales in Sacramento County at least, and compared to last year. And so to take out that many buyers in the market, it sort of created this sluggishness, and I think just we're still kind of recovering from that. And finally, these last couple months, their sales volume did increase a little, but overall, it's still down from where it was before.
So I know this is probably the age-old question that you get is, what do you think is going to happen towards the fall?
Yeah, isn't that the $1 million question?
I always say if I knew the answer, I'd be in Tahiti sipping Mai Tais, right? I wouldn't.
Exactly. I would definitely, my bank account would be a whole lot fatter than it is. I say this, first, my crystal ball is broken, and so it's been broken for a long time. And like I say, predicting real estate is a little bit like predicting what Justin Bieber is going to do next. You never know what that kid's going to do. And so, I mean, it's hard to say. I will say that the market seems to be poised for a market that is going to be slower. And I was talking about that on my blog on January, really because the market can no longer be driven by those 3.5% interest rates or all those out-of-town cash investors. And so it's really it has to be a dynamic where the market's more driven by the local economy, as I was saying. And so it's poised to be slower, I think, also because affordability is coming into play, since the job market really hasn't been all what we want it to be yet. And so we're really going to have to, have jobs catch up to where the market went. And so the question of, can people afford higher prices? And so unless loan programs change, or if the Fed, if they do decrease rates, that could be an X factor. But if they keep rates the same, or they go a little higher, it just seems that the market has to be slow, to put it at best.
But I mean, the rates always fascinate me because it's like, how low can they go? 3 and 4. I mean, when I first got into real estate in 1993, interest rates were at an all-time low of 8%, and and we thought, wow, man, they're never going to get much lower than that. And then they keep going lower. It's just kind of craziness. I'm not sure that needs to, I mean, obviously that's an important deciding factor, but they can't go to zero. I suppose they could, but they're not going to go negative zero. So people have
I certainly I would hope not. I mean, I think what I would be more concerned, I think, if the Fed does decrease rates to 3.5% again, just because I feel like it would take our market even further up, and I feel like, hey, let's slow down a bit here, because that's going to get us into some trouble. And so, but yeah, I mean, 4%, 4.5% rates, I mean, these are incredible, and from a historical context, it's quite amazing how low. And you hear people say, I bought my house in 1980, and we thought it was a great deal to have 12% rates. So
exactly. So how did you end up getting into the appraisal business? What took you there?
Well, I was a teacher, and I love to teach, and that's one of the reasons why I visit real estate offices. I just love it so much, just to help educate. And then my wife got pregnant, and we thought it was our goal to have her stay at home. And, but my teacher's salary wasn't going to cut it. And so I knew a couple of appraisers and said, would you guys be willing to train me? And sure enough, they did. And passed my state license, and did an apprenticeship for 2,000 hours, and the rest is history. And that was been an appraiser full time since 2003.
So, what kind of fascinating things have you seen? I mean, you've been doing this now. You've been through really kind of the low to the high to the low to all of this kind of stuff. And what would you say has been really the thing that impacts value the most in what's going on with the market? Over that period of time, it's changed so much, so I'm not sure that question was very clear, but
well, I mean, I think are you just asking what helps a property be worth the most? Is that kind of where you're going?
I think so. Like, one of the questions frequently is asked, as a real estate agent, clients ask, well, I just got this question today, as a matter of fact, is what improvements can we do that will really help the value? And it always seems like the improvements are not equal to the value, or the cost of the improvements are not equal to the value, right? So somebody puts in a pool and spends, $50,000 on a pool, does not mean they're going to increase the value of their home by that, correct?
that is so true. There's a huge difference between cost and value. The price of something versus what you can really get out of the market. And really what I tell people, the thing that impacts value the most is really what the market's doing, rather than what you're doing to your home. If the market's increasing, then you can do absolutely nothing to your house, and you sit back and you're going to gain equity overnight. Or if the market's declining, then there's probably very little you can do to keep up with that pace of the decline, depending on how aggressive it is. And of course, what sells a home, probably the kitchen and maybe the bathrooms, of course the layout, and we could go on and on about everything, but even say a kitchen remodel, if a homeowner spends $30,000, they're probably not going to find a buyer who's going to pay $30,000 more for that house. And so, right away. And so really, I think some of the things that homeowners will have to spend money on, they'll realize that value when they sell years down the road. And so, but otherwise, I just really think the market's the main thing. And I know that's not an attractive answer, but I see all these lists where, remodel your bathroom and it'll be worth X amount, and redo your kitchen and it'll be worth, you'll get this amount out. But I think a lot of times, really, you hardly ever realize the full cost of what you put in. Okay? And the same is true if you do an addition, and you might have to spend $100 a square foot or more to build something to add on to your house, but you're probably not going to get that out in the market right away.
So that brings me to a question that talks about adjustments. So funny thing is, when 7 or 8 years ago, when the market started to crash, we got requested to do a lot of BPOs, right, broker price opinions,
Oh, yeah.
which is basically kind of a dramatically scaled down, cheaper version of an appraisal.
Yeah.
And it's done by real estate agents, certainly not done by licensed appraisers. And on those, you're always trying to adjust for different things. And so adjustments always kind of fascinated me. Like if a house is a 3-bedroom versus a 4-bedroom, like how do you adjust for the difference in those when you're putting together your appraisal?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And really, the adjustment, it can come from a few places. Number one, the appraiser can make it up, and I don't recommend that for anyone because in a lot of cases, you'll see on an appraisal, why do appraisers always adjust $2,500 for a half bath, or $5,000 for a full bath, or $10,000 for a pool, or $50 per square foot for square footage? And so, if those adjustments are always the same, then that's the first danger sign. And I'll say because the adjustments are going to depend on the neighborhood. A custom neighborhood, you might have adjustments that are very significant for square footage, but in a first-time buyer community or a neighborhood that's struggling with blight, you might see an adjustment for square footage at say $25 or $30 a square foot, but that could be $100 in a different neighborhood. And so I'll say adjustments are really based on comparing homes with certain features. And say, for example, you might look at a house that's 1,200 square feet versus a house that's 1,400 square feet. And so you'll have to look and say, well, how much more did that house that's otherwise identical to the 1,200 square foot house, how much did that 1,400 square foot house sell for? So, say if it was, $10,000 more, then that would be, okay, then the market's willing to pay $50 per square foot for size. And so, but, what complicates it is that maybe the adjustment, maybe it's not so much square footage, but maybe that house has an extra bedroom. And so appraisers really have to think through those issues and say, well, is it the bedroom? Is it the square footage? What am I really looking at here? Or maybe there's an extra bathroom, and it's kind of a combination of all those things. And so if you're not careful, you can make adjustments for everything and then accidentally, appraise something too low or get something wrong, get it too high.
So one of the questions that comes up a lot of times, too, is how come a smaller home in a community will be worth more per square foot or will sell for more per square foot than a larger home? Like, let's say you've got like a 1,500 square foot home and it's in a neighborhood too where there might be 2,800 square foot homes. And so a lot of times, of course, the smaller home appraises, or prices out a lot more per square foot. Why is that?
Well, it really comes down to there's a different price per square foot depending on the size of the house. And when you think about it, it comes down to, in some senses, cost, because it costs a whole lot more to build that smaller house. If you think about it this way, say you're working with a 1,500 square foot house and it costs X amount, whatever that amount is. Well, if a builder was going to build a house twice the size, all they would have to do is add on a different story. The foundation's already there, the roof is already there, most of the infrastructure's already there, plumbing's already there. Basically everything is there. The builder simply has to build up. And so it's going to cost a whole lot less for that second story. And so you could effectively as a builder, save a whole lot of money on that production cost. And so that's why builders a lot of times, even though want to build larger homes and sell larger homes, even though I think in the media we want to talk about energy efficiency and how important smaller homes are for the wave of the future, but builders are thinking, hey man, I want to build that big house because I'm going to make more money. So,
Exactly.
And so to get back to the square footage, though, is that you might look at, say, a 1,500 square foot house that might have a square footage of $170 per square foot, and you find that out by looking at other 1,500 square foot, 1,400 square foot models, and, well, what's the price per square foot for these similar houses? But you might look at another size house, even just a few hundred square feet less, and say 1,200 square feet, and that model might be selling at $190 per square foot. And so there could be a big value difference even though there's just a few hundred square feet difference there. And I see that all the time with, sometimes I'm handed a stack of comps by real estate agents, and they're really not comparable because they're kind of operating in a whole different price per square foot range. And so it just comes down to, you got to compare apples to apples.
So that actually ties us right into Zillow.
Zillow, everyone's
How
friend. Everyone
accurate.
loves Zillow.
I know. So, they've actually gotten, I have to give them a little bit of credit, they've gotten better over the last year or so. But what is your opinion of Zillow, and how accurate do you think it is?
Interesting. Zillow, I think it's a neat tool. And they tout themselves as a ballpark figure, and they say, we're not an appraisal and blah, 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 but really, I think from a marketing standpoint, from a realistic standpoint, they are setting themselves up as the online market expert. And so I think that on one hand they say, yeah, don't, look to the professionals, but on the other hand, I think they're setting themselves up as a professional. So what I think of their values, I think it's extremely hit and miss. And so you might have sometimes in a tract neighborhood where values are somewhat realistic, but other times you could have a property that's off easily by 26%, 25%, 50%, 40%. I'm actually looking in front of me. I have a few blog posts that compare 10 actual appraisals with Zestimates, the Zillow values, and yeah, it's amazing how much they can be off, whether low or too high, because I really think that Zillow doesn't know the idiosyncrasies of the market. They have no idea about condition, or sometimes in classic areas of Sacramento, in classic neighborhoods, you might have streets that have a premium, even in Placer County, in places where, this house, there's something really special about this, or there's something special about the street, and that's not something that Zillow can understand. I mean, because after all, real estate is so much about emotions, and appraisers have to interpret, what's really motivating the buyer to make this purchase. And so, there might be that emotional element about that great room concept in this property that drove 10 buyers to offer over asking price, and that probably says something about the market for this house. And so it's interesting. I mean, it's hard for humans to tap into that, and so it's definitely going to be difficult for a machine, so to speak.
It like where I live is a perfect example. So I live out in the Lincoln area by off of Sierra College, and we live on.
Yeah, I saw you posted on Facebook the other day. It looked like you have a nice little rural area there.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing is that when you look on Zillow, I actually live, as a crow flies, probably less than 3/4 of a mile from Casa Verdera. And Casa Verdera, for those who aren't in the area, is a really high-end, luxury home area. Now, my house, on the other hand, is not. I live in a, very simple house on 5 acres. But when you look at the Zestimates, it pulls from Casa Verdera. So it always makes my house look like it's worth a heck of a lot more than it is because I live so close. I live within the 1 mile radius that they usually use.
Yeah.
And so
hey, that's great.
I know. I see these estimates. I'm like, woohoo! But they're not even remotely close to what is currently, what my house would sell for on the current market. You brought up emotion, and I always think that that's so fascinating because as having been in real estate for 20 years now, people always come to you trying to be logical, right? Like, well, the numbers have to make sense and all this. And in all the 3,000 homes I've sold, it's never logical. It's always emotional. And the house
Yeah.
that we bought, that I was just talking about, that we've lived in for 20 years, I literally came down the road. It was a dirt road, came around the corner, and there was a huge oak tree with a tree house in it. And I called my husband. We had a little boy at the time. I said, "We're buying a house."
We found it.
and he said, "No, we're not." I'm like, "Yes, we are." I fell in love
Yes.
with the house, and then I walked up to the house, and it was vacant. And I peeked in the back window, and there was a huge kitchen. And I said, "Again, guess what? We're buying a house." It was completely illogical, all emotional reasons for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's how real estate is. Yeah, I completely agree.
So does that make it difficult when you are appraising, like, specifically for a seller or buyer? Because the sellers always want to point out, well, I have ceiling fans, so my house has got to be worth more, right? And
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I have custom switch plates throughout the house, so my house is worth so much more. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think it comes down to one thing is that appraisers really need to interview real estate agents, and because on one hand you have data that you're looking at. There's, you can look up in tax records and understand that a sale sold, at a certain level. This house sold, and it's a certain size, and it has a certain bed and bath count and lot size. But really, what appraisers need to uncover is what motivated the buyer to purchase this home, and and understanding the market surrounding that house and all the other homes. And so it can definitely be interesting to interpret, but I really think it comes down to too that appraisers are searching for market value. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that in the real estate community, because a lot of people think, well, but I have a willing buyer and a willing seller, so we should be able to get this appraised value. But you can have a buyer and seller come together, and their agreed upon price doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the rest of the market would do. And so when an appraiser is looking for what is market value, it's really the most probable price that property should bring in an open and competitive market. It's not your distressed value, or grandma selling to her granddaughter low price, or San Francisco Bay Area investor coming out and they're willing to pay more than anyone that price. It's what if you lined up 100 buyers? How much would most of them pay? I find that to be a really good picture for thinking about what market value is.
That's a great way to look at it. I hear that frequently from sellers too about the Bay Area. Well, somebody from the Bay Area, will come up and pay for it. Now, I always want to say, well, do you think that the people from the Bay Area are not as smart? Or, they don't know, what the values are? Yeah, it's cheaper compared to where they're at, but, they're still going to base it. There's that classic saying, value is what someone's willing to pay. Because you can appraise it,
yeah, unless
put whatever you want price on it, but if no one's willing to pay it, then that affects the value.
Yeah, definitely. And since the appraiser is being hired by the lender to help assess risk and answer the question, should we make a loan on this, the lender's not interested in whether one buyer is willing to pay because they just love this house so much they're willing to spend $40,000 more than anyone. They're more interested in, hey, if this went into foreclosure, can we resell it? Who can we resell it to? And what are the typical 100 buyers going to pay for this thing? And so that's an important distinction in my mind.
Well, yeah, because the buyers are emotional, but the lenders are not. They're simply looking at the numbers and rate of return and that kind of thing. That was
they're
the hard
making an
part
investment.
in handling a lot of the bank-owned homes, is that in representing the banks, a lot of times, agents and buyers would come to me and give me this whole list of reasons why the seller should sell it at a different price. I was like, well, they don't look at any of that. They really just look at the numbers, right?
Bottom line, yeah. Boy, it was
Bottom
interesting,
line.
though, in the market. When the foreclosure flood first started unfolding, especially in 2008, 2009, you could see just, 70% of the market was foreclosures. But, now it's only about 7.5% REO sales, which is just down significantly. But at first, these properties were just being given away. And it really took a couple of years, as I'm sure you know, with your REO portfolio, for the banks to start cleaning them up and putting new carpet and paint and trying to sell them at a more realistic level. So So I guess that's a one redemptive thread in the whole picture.
Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit of, well, I don't know if it's fun stuff, but the interesting stuff. So I'd love to hear about some of the really kind of quirky, wacky appraisals you've had to do. There's some really unique homes out there and different scenarios. So you got a couple good juicy stories for us?
Yeah, well, I guess the first one that comes to mind, I guess it's more of a sad story than anything, but I appraised a suicide house. I don't know, is that too touchy?
Oh yeah, that could be tough. It's hard to, yeah, it's hard to sell those many times. I know that when people ask about a death in a home from the buyer perspective, if somebody died peacefully in the house, it doesn't seem to be nearly as much of an issue as a suicide or murder.
Yeah, yeah,
So
definitely.
how do you adjust for value in that situation? That's totally emotional.
Yeah, it was. And the interesting thing about this one is that it was in the heat of the intense market last year. And so there was less than a one month supply of houses on the market. And so competition was absolutely fierce. And so, of course, I didn't know it was a suicide house until the very end. I almost finished my appraisal, and then I saw on MLS, it's a death on property earlier this year, right before I pushed submit, and I thought, uh-oh. So I called the agent and said, yeah, there was a suicide on this property. And what I had to do was I interviewed the agent first of all and said, how did buyers respond to this property knowing there was a suicide? And there were certain cultures who said, no way, we're not going to have anything to do with this. But there were 8 offers on this property. It was kind of a fixer. It really was selling at a level consistent with other fixers. And so I had to really ask the question, is it selling at this level because it's a fixer or because it's a suicide, or there's a little bit of both? And so I tracked down a bunch of other recent properties where there had been a suicide, and I interviewed all the agents and just asked them questions. And, well, how did buyers respond to this? And in this crazy market where people are overbidding and needing to get into something and tired of getting bid out of properties and offering 25 times, and so in this market it really didn't make that much of a difference. But the interesting thing in today's market, inventory has doubled. The market's definitely softer. There would be a much bigger reaction. And so, so something like that, it really depends on what's happening in the market. And so, and of course, I think just the gritty circumstances of what happened, where it happened. But that was definitely an interesting one, and that's kind of stuck with me. I actually just shared about that this week at an appraisal organization I belong to. So, but that was
I know I've
interesting.
had a few of those situations happen over the years, and it definitely, part of it is culture driven for sure. Certain cultures are like not going to live there; they just won't do it. And then other people, it doesn't seem to bother them. I think when I think about what would affect me personally, I think I would have a tough time with that. I think if someone died naturally, like unfortunately my grandfather passed away about a year ago, and he passed away in our guest house, and I don't think that bothers people as much as suicide or murders. I had a house I sold a few years back, and there it was in the other part of town, and there had been a murder in the front yard. So some domestic dispute, and the boyfriend killed the other boyfriend. It was awful, but it didn't seem to affect the value, but it did limit the audience, I would say.
Yes, that.
Who were willing
And
to pay.
You're right. I think that it absolutely can limit the marketability, which I think would, essentially limit the value and lower the value at some point. But sometimes it might just limit the marketability. Then depending on the market, it really might sell at that level, but it just might take a little longer. You have to find that special buyer.
Funny story. A few years back, I had a house out in the Newcastle Penryn area, and I had sold this house a couple times for various reasons, and I think I was on the third time selling it for different people. And the buyer, I was representing the seller, and the buyer went down to the school district to get their kids registered for the school. And the gal at the front desk said, "Oh, you're buying that house? That house is haunted."
Oh no.
And so the buyer came back and said, well, we've heard that the house is haunted. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure how you would prove or disprove that one, right? It's like the seller didn't have any issues with it being haunted that I'm aware of, but it ended up being a really weird situation, and come to find out that it wasn't the house that was haunted. Apparently it was the lot next door, where way back in the, however long ago it was, when the Chinese built those rock walls throughout Newcastle, Penryn area, and apparently a mine had crashed, and some of the workers had fallen in and died in there, and so supposedly the lot next door was haunted. But it was such a quirky situation. I'm like, well, I don't know how to prove or disprove that one. Like, how how do you solve that problem? That wasn't really an appraisal issue, but it was a funny story. So what are some, do you have any other good stories? I know we had a house come up recently, and we couldn't figure out how the heck to value it. It was 3 homes on a 2-acre lot out there in the Roseville side, kind of way out there off of Willarga, and there's nothing like that. So we were trying to figure out how the heck do we determine the value.
Well, that's when you rejoice that you are a listing agent, because then you can just list it at whatever. If it doesn't sell, I mean, obviously you want it to sell, but the appraisers definitely got the harder job on that one. There has to be something somewhere, and throughout the history of MLS, you can look back, even go back to 1998 and find something. What's the market willing to pay for that sort of unique property? And you might find a lot of houses that are 2 houses on one lot, but 3 houses, that's going to be really tough. And so that would be an expensive appraisal, and some of those sometimes it's just appraisers would really have to say, is this going to be worth my time to really be able to do effectively. But that's interesting. I appraised one recently where the house was just in utter disarray. It looked like the guy was preparing for the apocalypse, just because they were all, I thought that's what it was actually. I showed some friends some aerial views of the property, and there was just this concrete dome built on the property. And so I had to figure out, well, what is this worth, and what's it worth when there's these really funky basements that are dug out underneath the house. And that was really, really interesting, to say the least.
Wow. Yeah, I had a house years ago where only thing I could say is they didn't have the hoarder show back then, or it would have for sure been on the hoarder show. I think the buyer ended up leveling the house, and because it was so bad. It was so bad. And I remember my marketing director at the time was hilarious. I said, well, how are we going to market this one? She goes, I took a picture of the house next door and said, wouldn't you love to live next door to that one?
Oh, yeah, that's certainly true. I've definitely come across hoarder houses also, and it's always sad, and but just tragic and complicated from the real estate standpoint. But because you never know. I mean, from a practical safety issue or condition issue, you never know what's behind those walls. You can't see it, and so is there mold growing there, and so you never know. But I would say the most uncomfortable thing that's ever happened is I once had a grown man greet me in the door when I came up to the door, and he was wearing nothing but SpongeBob boxers. And that's all he wore during the inspection. He was laying on the couch in sort of this almost provocative pose, and that was a really, really quick inspection. So
you're like, wow, I got someplace to go.
Yeah, come on, man, put on some clothes, or at least SpongeBob. That's just, what's going on, my man?
I can't even tell you how many different things. I've walked in on all kinds of stuff. I know one of the funniest stories was a gal. She's a good friend of mine now, and we'd been looking for a while, and she brought her family. And she's one of 4 sisters and a brother. And so we show up to this house. The house is supposed to be vacant, and she gets her family there, and they come with 2 vans. So there's like 10 of them, right, coming to see this house. So I kind of knock on the door, bang, I'm really loud, like I always am. Hello, hello, real estate agent. opened the door, and there was like some furniture in the house, but kind of sparsely furnished. And I was like, okay. So I walk in, and all of a sudden her whole family, they all kind of plow into the house, and they just spread like ants. And so I'm standing in there, all of a sudden I hear one of them scream from upstairs. I'm like, uh-oh. All of a sudden she comes running down the stairs, and I'm like, what's going on? She goes, there was a guy in the bathtub taking a bath.
Oh, no.
And had left the door open. So, I got, yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
It
yeah,
was,
didn't want to
she
see
was
that.
pretty freaked out, but it was funny after the fact, but at the time a little stressful, because I was like, dude, why didn't you, you didn't hear anybody, you didn't hear all these people walking through the house. Sometimes you got to wonder if it's intentional. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. If I could say one that reminded me, I walked in on a guy once who was, let's just say he was watching a movie that was meant for adults. And so I was just like, come on, man, you heard me knocking on the door. Just, just hold off for a minute. So
Exactly. Give me a break. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, it's been a ton of fun talking to you today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that you teach some classes, and I see that on your website, sacramentoappraisalblog.com, but I'll post it on my
You got
site
it.
too. And you teach classes, and you always have a really informative blog. As a matter of fact, I just posted a link from yours onto my Facebook a few minutes ago because it was some great insight on the local market.
You are awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for chatting with us today, and we'll be sure to follow your blog and definitely share this podcast with all your friends.
Hey, will do. I'll make sure to post it on my blog too. And thanks again. Really, really appreciate it. And hope everyone out there listening, you're doing well.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
thanks. You too, Margaret. Take care. Bye.